Okay, hi. So, um, this past day, I was at a senior center. They were having like a Valentine's Day thing, and so I took my mother. I'm sitting at a table, and there was a woman there next to my mom who was African American, about maybe I'd say in her 70s. She would probably be like your maybe like your grandmother or your auntie, or older auntie. So very still quite active, and but it's very important because this demographic is really the core voting demographic for the Democratic Party. So basically, we're talking about African American women above the age of 65, and they always vote, and they are core. Like if they turn out, that can make a difference in the campaign, and what their opinion of a candidate really matters. And so uh, I've started to talk to like when I encounter them, women from this demographic, because first it was just out of curiosity because these are the Joe Biden voters, like that that online I hear people like, well, who could be for Joe Biden, but this group, they are for Joe Biden. And so I've started to reach out and talk with them, and when I encounter them, and there's a couple things I usually find. So yes, they tend to like Joe Biden. I've also found that they really, generally speaking, aren't feeling Bernie Sanders. They don't really feel it. They just like, he's not it. Especially in light of Trump there, like going up against Trump. Um, this idea of going like who can defeat Trump is really a big deal for them. So they wanted to, at least the ones I've talked to, they wanted to like Kamala Harris. They wanted to, I mean, especially because they're African American women themselves, but they're like, they weren't really feeling necessarily that this would be strong enough or the right kind of strength to defeat Donald Trump and the kind of person that he is. And I'm starting to see some elements of with some curiosity and liking of Bloomberg because they feel that he could be strong enough to go up against Trump. But I'm bringing this up, this talking to this demographic, uh, because it's caused me to really come to the topic of this video, which is this idea that, like, did you really know that Andrew Yang uh, appeals to both progressives as well as to moderate Democrats? Because one of the things that shocked me over, or surprised me over the past 6 months, is I encounter African American women 65 and above, and I start talking with them about the campaign. What surprises me is that they know about Andrew Yang. I'm like, so even though they like Biden, are probably going to vote for him because they think he's strongest, and now they're starting to question it. They pay attention. They've noticed Andrew Yang. They noticed that he's bright, that he's a smart guy, fresh, innovative ideas, and even that what really surprised me is they even appreciate his humor. So I mean, I think I would have thought that the whole those of you who were following the campaign at the time, the that having like the two guys in like the two white guys in New Hampshire, they got on their knees, and he put whipped cream in their mouth. I guess I would have thought that they would not have liked this, but at least one of my friends who fit this demographic, she surprised me. She was saying, "Well, no, in this day of age that we're in with Trump and stuff like that, it actually calms her down. Like it's good to have someone with a sense of humor." So there you go. So again, so the main point I want to make here, I'm going to make, is that Andrew Yang does appeal to both progressives and to moderate Democrats. Well, why does that matter? Well, one reason that we can see that it matters is if you looked at the New York Times endorsement, that was a big thing that they talked about. They're like, well, and they ended up choosing Elizabeth Warren and as well as um, Amy Klobuchar because each represented this wing within the Democratic Party, the progressive wing and the moderate Democratic wing, and especially those of us online, we actually see this all the time. Like usually, progressives tend to be the most vocal, and they're always like, nope, we can't have a centrist, it's not going to work, whatever. But I want to just talk about those two groups briefly in terms of the Iowa and New Hampshire results. Uh, I think in terms of the election so far, I think it's a fair thing to say that in the eyes of most people, the progressives in this race are Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, and those who are being viewed as centrist or moderate Dems would include Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and Amy Klobuchar. Now, this is what the math tells us. The math tells and shows us that in Iowa, that only 44% of the voters measured by Sanders and Warren were progressive. And then in terms of the moderates, that was like over like 54% of the vote. And if you actually looked at the New Hampshire primary, it's even more stark that the progressive side, even though Bernie Sanders won, the progressive side was only 35%. And the moderate candidates, they soaked up about 52% of the vote. So what we're running into in this election is that the progressives are most vocal, but that and numerically the moderates are more significant. So what does this have to do with Andrew Yang? I'm really going to claim here that Andrew Yang is yeah, he appeals to both groups. Like in other words, with progressives, and just think about your encounters with people who support Bernie or support Elizabeth Warren. Um, Sometimes they're before Andrew Yang suspended his campaign. Usually you'd see either, let's say, they some grudging like, but sort of holding back from maybe Warren supporters, and sometimes like antagonism from the Bernie supporters. And but then all of a sudden, after the he's out of the race, it's something different. All of a sudden, they're talking about how great he is and all this other stuff. I guess I want to maybe suggest to everyone that what's going on here is he's a competitive threat to them, to the progressives, and I think they know it. On some level, they know it because Andrew's coming up with these bold, fresh ideas, which is what progressives say is what they usually want. Forward thinking progressive ideas. And yet here's this other person on a very different wavelength than what they're used to. And and so he's viewed as a competitive threat. So and part of that is that he appeals. He is progressive like. But then on the other side, with moderate Dems, it's sort of funny too to me how moderate Dems, like sort of like Biden, Buttigieg, and Klobuchar, they're actually kind of at a distance from Yang. They on the debate stage they didn't really go at him. They kind of just sort of had some arm's length. I don't really have much understanding about that beyond a few anecdotes, where sometimes I would be talking with someone who was a self-described moderate Dem. I'm thinking of one person in particular, and we were talking about Yang, but he said, "Well, I'm not really settled yet on Yang. I'm actually thinking about maybe Buttigieg or Klobuchar." And so I think I'm starting to notice that basically that there's why is it that Andrew appeals to moderates, and so this is what I think it is. Usually among Democrats, you usually have like either they're people who have bold ideas, like progressives, but you notice most of those people also tend to be highly emotional too. So that would mean things like Bernie Sanders. He's talking about bold ideas, but he's kind of angry. Like he's angry all the time. They're talking about the billionaires or something or some big interest. But then if you go to even Elizabeth Warren, she talks bold ideas, but she's always very she's ready for the fight. She's always ready for the fight. And whereas I think if you go to moderates, they're not only incremental in their ideas, but even their tone, they're just much more moderate. They're much more moderate about what they're doing. And what's interesting about Andrew Yang to me is that he's a bit of both. Like in other words, his ideas are very bold, like like the freedom dividend and democracy dollars. But unlike the progressives, he's not angry all the time, and he's not always fighting. He's actually being very human. And so, in that sense, he's very similar to Barack Obama in a way. Like Barack Obama used to talk about all this change and hope, this like, forward thinking stuff, but he was always very moderate. He could talk about these new things without scaring people about change. And so Andrew has that. And so I think it's going to be, I, I want to bring this up and share it and then post it. So then, like, you can watch this and then maybe share it in the coming weeks to come, because we know that Andrews is going to be spending, he said, within the next 2 to 6 weeks, he's going to talk about what's going to happen next, right? Um, but but beyond that, I think there's beyond that with there's going to be a lot of Yang Gang are involved in uh, doing other things like organizing themselves in various ways, and so as you do that, as you go off and engage other people about Andrew Yang and what his policies are, I always encourage you to keep this in mind, that when you're engaging people, what was it that liked about Andrew? Not some, because I know in Yang Gang sometimes we talk about what we like this is what we like about Andrew, but I think I think an eye we can see from that group, that so our grandmothers, our aunties, in the Black community, that there is something about Andrew that does appeal. He is not a typical progressive, and he is not a moderate Democrat, and so there's something about his policies and the way he talks about them, and and what they are, that actually allows us to actually cross both ways. So again, as we as Yang Gang organize and figure out what our next steps are, as supporters of Andrew Yang, let's keep in mind that it's not just simply looking at the Democrats versus the Republicans, but just acknowledging and embracing how we are connecting, or we provide a possibility of bridging a gap between the progressive side, the progressive Democrats, and the more moderate Democrats.